Probably because I am Rick's wife, I'm here. It's called a labour of love. I am a retired priest in the Anglican Diocese of Perth, although I do go to Northam once a month, so hello Northam, and to Merredin on a fifth Sunday of the month, so hello Merredin. But greetings to you all here and to our friends out in the rural region. Some years ago, I completed a Master's of Practical Theology in the pastoral and spiritual care of older persons, particularly focused on older persons in their own homes. And my practical research involved interviewing clergy and lay people within the Perth Diocese, both in the city area and in the rural centres. But I've also had a lot of experience ministering in aged care facilities, including as recently as last year, when I was doing locum and covering at St Basil's Murdoch Winthrop. So I still draw on a lot of what I learnt and discovered and have experienced through aged care, visiting older people in their homes, or generally just chatting with them. So today we'll be just sharing some things that I have learnt along the way. What I say, of course, is not exhaustive, and each aged care facility, each older person, each situation is unique. But I think there are maybe some common guidelines that we can share. I'm sure it goes without saying that society in general is facing an ageing population, both right now and will increasingly be doing so. And I believe the church therefore needs to ensure it claims its rightful place in supporting older persons. You have already heard this morning on the role of LPMs, including with aged care facilities, but my presentation focuses on relationships with older people. It won't all be relevant to all of you, but you can take information back to your parish priest if you think that's appropriate, or to some LPMs who aren't here today, or for some budding LPMs. In my research and thesis, I made a distinction between older persons and the sick, because they are not the same, even though a prayer book for Australia would have us think otherwise. Not sure if you've ever noticed under the section prayers for various occasions, prayers for the aged are in the same sentence as for the infirm, the bereaved, the lonely, the sick and suffering, thus implying all older people fit into one or all of those categories. In the section prayers for society and the common life, one prayer under the heading the age speaks of older persons as having given a lifetime of service, thus suggesting their service has ended. The second prayer for the aged comes under the prayers for the poor and neglected, thus implying all older persons are poor and neglected. I have a much more positive approach to older people. My presentation today is made with the full knowledge that human resources in most parishes are limited, some extremely so. And this is particularly true in rural centres that rely on occasional supply priests to take Eucharist for them, and with LPMs taking morning prayer in between times, trying to keep faith communities together. That said, in small country towns, parishioners and others, of course, generally care and support for each other simply because they know each other well. So that does help a bit. So as I speak, please do not feel overwhelmed. I'm covering as much as possible. Just take away what might be useful for your situation. And I'll begin with aged care, then ministry to older people in their home, and finally within the church. And what I say in aged care, which I'll start with now, I know that a number of you either take aged care services or contribute in a significant way taking church in aged care. There are, of course, two different settings to taking a church service outside of our regular Sunday services. One in an independent living facility where residents are just that, independent, usually mobile and generally able to participate and even contribute in the service. And then there is the more high dependency aged care facility, where residents may be more able just to come along and just enjoy the singing if we have hymns. Both services are very significant in the lives of the residents. For many, and I have heard this over and over again, it is a reconnection, or maybe just a connection with God at a time when end-of-life thinking becomes more pronounced. In fact, there is evidence supporting this, that many older persons who have not previously been involved in a church community or had a particularly religious background may in fact begin to seek pastoral and or spiritual support in later years. So even before we go to aged care, we need to prepare well, as we would do with anything that we do. If we don't have a structure, there is a risk that we will just go on for too long and the residents may lose concentration. As I mentioned, chapel, church is a very significant time for residents, and we need to honour that through our preparation. If, as an LPM, you have permission to take reserved sacrament to an aged care facility or indeed a home, you must use the communion by extension service that I believe Reverend Jacob handed out this morning. But there is scope within that, I believe, to add authorised liturgy, such as the Gloria, the Creed, but the structure must be followed. My experience is that chapel needs to be 30 to 40 minutes. Anything less hardly makes it worthwhile for the staff to spend all the time gathering the residents together. Anything more, residents may start to become restless or go to sleep if they haven't already. It is best to have a number of shorter readings or stories rather than one long one, of course, because the attention span of these older residents, as we know, can be limited. But when choosing our readings or our stories, be mindful of the residents' lifestyle. Be careful we don't transfer our own life, our own situation and needs and struggles onto theirs. For example, a certain poem or prayer may help us slow down or take regular time with God, but inevitably that won't be meaningful for most residents. They really need to slow down, and in fact, many of them would like to speed up. Only LPMs with a license to preach can give an actual sermon or homily, but there are many ways of still saying something about the readings or a particular church festival or feast day. And there are many resources for little reflections to draw upon. Or you might say something like, today's Bible reading reminds me of and say something about how it might have meant something in your life. Personal stories are always engaging. I have found that some of the early holy people or mystics make for engaging talks, and appraisals of their life can be easily found and downloaded on the internet. For example, I've just started a course through Richard Raw's Centre for Action and Contemplation on St. Teresa of Avila. And if you know anything about St. Teresa, she's known for many of her mystical experiences that really impacted her life. Sometimes she would get into such a spiritual trance, she would rise off the ground. And there's one story during choir, she lifted her feet several feet off the ground, and then opened her eyes and looked down, and then looked up again and said, put me down right this minute. And God did. Now, residents enjoy little stories like this. They find them amusing. St. Patrick is another one. We could do a summary of something about St. Patrick, one of his expeditions, and his, of course, is one who the residents may be familiar with. So just pick out some fascinating detail about someone's life and then could conclude with a brief summary of how we might learn something from them. But again, remember, don't make it too long. Visual aids are great, so prepare something to take along, to hand out, maybe some leaves or a piece of material, flowers, perfumes, just something that, particularly in the high dependency, that people might like to hand around and they can touch or smell. And consider ways in which we may be able to include the residents. So think ahead to maybe the independent living. Can someone there do a Bible reading? Could they help with another part of the service? And depending on the residents again, and probably more so in independent living, even ask questions or have a little bit of a discussion. So now we're well prepared when we arrive with our presentation. Whether we are leading or assisting with chapel, introduce ourselves and the church from which we come each time. This reinforces our name to the residents who may well have forgotten since the last time we were there, especially if services are only monthly, but even fortnightly can be a long time. Plus, there may be some new residents or some visitors on the day. It's lovely when family come with the residents. Of course, if there is a microphone available, use it to enhance our voice and speak slowly and clearly. But I believe Bishop Jeremy's already given us the talk today on how to use our voice, so you're well ahead already. Avoid jargon, big words and long sentences, and avoid phrases such as we all know, I'm sure you'll remember, or you know that wonderful hymn. Chances are they won't all know, they won't all remember. And we certainly don't want them to feel embarrassed because they don't know or they can't remember. And don't assume the residents, even in independent living, will be aware of an event we are talking about. For example, if referring to COVID, we don't say, well, I suggest we don't say, today we're thinking especially of the people in Sydney in lockdown. Okay, so what? So we would say something like, this past week there has been a big outbreak of COVID in Sydney. You know, that horrible virus that you might have had a jab for? Several areas are now in lockdown, so we'll think of them especially today. So don't assume they will know exactly what we're saying if it's just one little sentence. And this is my biggest bugbear. Be mindful how we refer to residents. We don't call them patients, and we try and remember their name, but don't call them sweetie and love and darling. It's bad enough being called those names in one's 60s by shop assistants, let alone in later years. It can be received as derogatory, demeaning, and a put down. It also has overtones of power over another. It isn't necessary. People have names. So try and use words throughout our leading of worship and our time with them that capture that this is their home. We are their guests. And don't underestimate what they may like in the way of hymns, if you have hymns. One locum recently chose all these old hymns in a high dependency facility, only to be told they were boring. Keep our prayers short and make them relevant to the resident's life. So we might give thanks and pray for the staff and family and friends, or for new friendships, pray for new residents, pray for something that might have come out of the reading, pray for those who usually come to chapel but can't be there today. Maybe if someone has died and we know that, give thanks for the life of that resident and pray for their family and friends. And when we pray the Lord's Prayer, many residents will pray the traditional version, even if we have the current version in front of us. That's fine. Their prayer of the heart is far more important than getting the words right. And it may be that these prayers can be broken up into different sections, or you just choose some. They're just some examples. So just some general points in aged care. If we are doing something with or for the residents, tell them what we are doing and why. For example, I'm just moving you over to that table, Millie, so you can have your cup of tea. Are you ready to go to church now, Harry? I'll take you to the room. I'm going to move over there now, Betty, to help Fiona choose the hymns. Older people, especially in higher care facilities, can develop such a sense of helplessness, no control over what they do and when they do anything. And so to explain why they are being moved helps with their sense of being involved. It kind of humanises them a bit more. And never approach a resident from behind and start talking to them, or worse, suddenly move them if they're in a wheelchair. It can give them such a fright, especially if they're having a wee snooze. And where possible, give residents a choice about things. So, for example, some may want to attend chapel or communion one time, but not another. Or with reserved sacrament, a resident may have communion one time, but not another. If unsure, just say, would you like communion today, Mrs. X? If not, maybe offer a blessing. If we're unsure whether a resident is allowed to have communion, there should be a staff member sitting in on chapel. We can just check with them. Never assume that because a resident may seem asleep, that they aren't aware of what's going on. Many times I've reached a resident with communion and they've opened their mouth to receive, or have given them a blessing and had in return, Amen. People with quite bad memory loss can be very unsettled, and there is quite a bit of evidence that shows that if they attend church or are visited by a religious person, their disposition changes for the better for quite some time after. So never underestimate the value of the present moment. That is why it's so important that church continues with aged care ministry. And remember, residents have not always been as they may be now. So now we're going to visit people at home, and I'm just going to grab a little bit of water. And some of this may also apply to aged care. I think there is often a resistance, maybe born out of fear, in communicating with older persons, especially with those with limited verbal ability, because we just don't know what to say. And this sadly often translates into avoidance of older persons, or a brief visit to give Holy Communion with no time to just sit and chat or listen. So hopefully what we share now will alleviate some of that resistance, if it exists at all. Anecdotal evidence suggests that for many older persons, human company is often one of the most comforting things that can be offered. As an older person struggling to come to terms with loneliness and isolation, Ellen Newton wrote in her book, This Bed, My Centre, that visitors don't need to bring things, they just need to bring themselves. The self is everything, she wrote. So when we do visit, some practical points. It's really important we don't move anything. Many older people in their home rely on things to be in the same place all the time, especially furniture, but also things that they may have on their little table next to them. They know exactly where everything is. For conversation starters, and this is where some people might find it a bit difficult, what can I say? So if required, quickly gaze around the room at something that might tell you of their life story or what's important to them. Some photos, some certificates of recognition or achievements on a sideboard or a wall, personally made craft items, a musical instrument. Almost all older people have an amazing story to tell. Let them tell it, even if it gets repeated on another visit. We don't visit for our sake. Maybe this follows up, resist the temptation to interject all the time with our own stories. This is primarily a time to listen. We probably have plenty of opportunities to talk about ourselves. Older people often don't. If we listen, I promise you we will learn. Of course, if we are asked something about ourselves, then obviously answer, but keep it relatively short. If you are taking reserved sacrament to someone in their home, allow enough time so it's not rushed for them. I remember my dear, now very late auntie, she lived to 101, but she was a faithful Anglican all her life. until she was not able to get to church anymore. Now, it was times of pastoral assistance, and they did bring her communion, but she said, oh, you know, they just kind of popped in and out, you know, and it kind of didn't have much meaning to her. And I've always remembered that it's just that pop in and pop out visit with communion. And I think if we do that, we risk diminishing the sacredness of the occasion by delivering communion in a hasty way, perhaps even diminishing the sacredness of the sacraments in the eyes of the older person. So avoid any visiting being, as one older person put it, a lick and a promise, or just offering a whistle-stop tour. The older we become, the more loss we, and probably most of us know this, the more loss we tend to have experienced. And so for many, that includes the loss of a spouse, but the loss of good friends also. And therefore, loneliness and isolation can creep in, often leading to depression. Reverend Dr. Elizabeth McKinlay, a former key person in Australia with respect to ministry to older persons, and indeed internationally, once quoted a study that demonstrated weekly 30-minute intentional pastoral care visits, oh, have I gone off? No, I haven't, that nurtured the spiritual aspect, had a positive effect on older persons with depression. However, once those weekly visits that were part of the study were finished, the depression increased. Now, of course, very few parishes could manage visiting each older person 30 minutes a week. But why I'm saying that is that the study highlights that any spiritual and pastoral support to persons with depression needs to be as regular and ongoing as possible, and it needs to be meaningful. It may also be that part of the problem for some older persons is boredom, on top of loneliness and isolation. They may well have home help to come daily or weekly. Family and friends may still pop in, but there are still many hours in the day. Again, Ellen Newton wrote, do we need to change something here? Oh, all right. I can hold it. I can hold it. No problem. Is that better? So again, Ellen Newton wrote, there's no love or thanks enough for Helen for all she is and has been to me. And I'm not unmindful of those golden friends who still come to see me on days when I'm the worst of company. But this happy exchange is only for a couple of hours a day. There are still all the other 20 or so tattered hours to be got through. But given 30-minute weekly visits are probably not possible, think of other ways we can support older persons who may be feeling isolated, lonely, bored, depressed. Perhaps we could encourage them to visit or telephone other older persons in the congregation, or a friend who may be in a similar situation. It could be an opportunity to introduce intergenerational relationships. An older person could ring a struggling parent and encourage them, or just be a listening ear. Or ring a new family who's just moved into the area or just turned up at church. Ring them and welcome them. Depending on the older person, they could perhaps provide English tutoring for those for whom English isn't their first language. Can some write cards? Could some host a home group? And when I wrote that about a home group, I recalled when I was chaplain to health and aged care in the Avon Valley. At 2 aged care centres, one in Brookton and one in Northam, I introduced a chaplain's chat, and we would have up to 6 residents come along. We discussed current affairs, faith issues, life issues, and I tell you, nothing was off limits. My hair curled sometimes. At Brookton, the oldest person there turned 100. And woe betide any staff member who did not have her ready in time for chaplain's chat. In Northam, there was a much younger lady in her mid-80s who one day shared quite deeply and concluded by saying, quite tearfully, that she had never shared that with anyone in her life before. It was a very holy, very sacred moment. And these occasions when older persons can minister to us, when ministry to older persons becomes ministry by older persons. By taking us to a sacred space and by the sharing of their story, they give us nourishment, encouragement for our own faith journey. The above possibilities can also be useful to suggest to older persons who seem to demand a lot of our time and expect more visitation than perhaps is possible to provide. All of that said, not all older persons, of course, are able to contribute. So it's important we find ways to ensure they still feel valued and still have a sense of belonging to a faith community. The need to belong and to be in relationship rarely diminishes. So we can take pew sheets and other pieces of information that we can give to them, or we can even offer to read to them if they have poor eyesight. We could take large print copies of things. Now, I probably shouldn't say this publicly, but I think it's a shame that the messenger is now only available online. Many older persons can't access it, and even if they can, it wouldn't be their preferred way of reading it. It used to be a great magazine for older persons to browse through at their leisure, rather than having to log onto a computer each time they wanted to read it. Now, of course, a parish can print copies, but it is an added cost to a parish as it's quite a big magazine with lots of photos. So I think that's a diminishment in our communication with a lot of older people in their homes and in aged care. And even those who come to church, there's nothing for them to take home. When you leave a home visit, leave things as you found them, or at least check what the person would like. So, shall I turn the TV back on for you? Would you like me to leave the door open, or shall I close it? Can I tidy up the cups, or would you like to? If they say to leave the cups, leave them. For many folk, this gives them something to do, and it gives them enormous pleasure that they can still do something for someone. It's important not to visit with the expectation that the person will remember the visit or who visited. But to quote Therese Lysort from her article, it's a long article, Memory, Funerals and the Communion of Saints, Growing Old and Practices of Remembering, she writes, like God's remembering of us, our presence to the elderly as we remember them sustains them. The reality of the communion of saints situates the elderly as equal partners in the body of Christ. Without the elderly, the church is not complete. And she concludes that the issue is not whether the older person can remember, but that they are actively and concretely remembered, especially by the church community. Again, never underestimate the value of the present moment for older people. Now, of course, some older people won't want to be visit or say they don't want to visit and aren't very welcoming, and we need to respect that. But it may be that just keeping in contact with these people is a way of reminding them that the church has not forgotten them and that someone would be available should they ever require some sort of support. Now, an occupational hazard of visiting at home is eating too much. Because I can't eat certain foods, I will always ask someone beforehand when I ring to make a visit not to provide food because I can't tolerate certain things. And people are generally pretty okay with that. I think there's much more of an awareness of dietary requirements now. And I often take my soy milk with me, and that seems to be okay as well. But one last point for visiting at home. I'm aware that for some older persons, there may still remain a sense that it is less valid receiving the sacraments or even a visit from someone other than the priest. When I did my survey interviews, a priest commented to this effect. He said, "I suspect for many that when I come through the door, God comes through the door." And this participant observed that such a feeling or reaction by older persons creates a fear that when they actually can't come to church anymore, that they will just be forgotten and that God will forget them. Now, you and I know that that can't possibly be true in reality, but the perception is real for the older person. Now, not for a moment, obviously suggesting that the practice of lay pastoral ministry be reduced. Rather, that we be alert to this perception in our older people and find ways to help them to accept a lay visitor as a valid extension of the worshipping community to which they previously belonged, and to help them appreciate that the authenticity of the sacraments does not rest with who serves them. Of course, that does not excuse the parish priest from visiting sometimes, as they do remain an important part of a pastoral care team. So now, some older persons in church. Now, my observations are that most churches are responding as best they can to an ageing church population, and that is to be commended. But it doesn't hurt to take regular stock takes of who might have stopped coming, who has gone off a roster. It's important to find out reasons for both, as they could be well addressed. Maybe they feel embarrassed about having to sit when others are standing and need to hear that it's absolutely fine to remain seated. God isn't at all bothered about these things. It's more important that they still come. Or maybe they find it difficult coming up to the altar to receive communion. Just offer to take it to them, to their seat. In Northam, hello again Northam, in Northam where I take a service once a month, as I said, a very faithful lady in her 90s wanted to keep doing Bible readings as she'd been doing them all her adult life. However, walking up to the lectern had become quite difficult for her. So she now stands in her place and does her Bible reading in a nice, loud, clear voice. Maybe likewise someone could lead the intercessions from their seat. But it is important, if someone does do that, it's still important that they can be heard. For older people coming to church, have large print copies of service booklets and other literature. I don't want to talk about transport because I think I might be opening a can of worms. I probably think there's a bit of occupational health and safety issue with transport and filling out forms and everything. So I'm just going to leave that one sit for now. I think it is a myth, something of a myth, that says older people stop coming to church because they don't like change. But hang on, the older folk we are talking about have in fact experienced very significant changes through their lifetime. You know, they've had introduction of sophisticated household appliances, mobile phones, medical treatment, the list could go on. I just think of the changes in my lifetime, and I'm only a young 70. So change is not foreign to older persons, and many have had to make significant adaptations to life over many years. It may be that the key to older persons responding more positively to change is for them to be helped to understand it and to be supported through it. As one of the participants in my survey commented, older persons are willing to let go of a lot of the familiar traditions if it brings new life, but that they don't respond well to change for change's sake. That is, if older persons can be helped to understand the reason or reasons for a particular change, they may more easily let go of the old in favour of the new. And this same participant commented, change is an education process, especially spiritually or liturgically. As ministers, we are treading on holy ground and need to respect that. We need to be able to enter their space where they're at, not expect them to automatically be in our space. So to conclude all of this, perhaps a common theme throughout what I've been saying is never to make assumptions about older people, never underestimate their value and their importance in the life and faith of the church until they take their last breath. Never underestimate the value of the present moment for older people. The church neglects older persons to its peril, for as the epistles teach, the body of Christ, the church, is made up of different parts, all of whom are members of that body. As such, that body is weaker for the exclusion of any part of it. Each part has an integral part to play, and all are invited to be participants in the Eucharistic community of the Christian faith. How am I going, chairperson?
Few minutes.
A few minutes. So they're my thoughts. I'm wondering whether anyone would like to share any of their experiences or thoughts about ministry to older people. Please, thank you.
On this, I'd say, many years ago, I looked after my mother-in-law who had dementia. She could always be a trip girl all her life. And then, when it came over the age group of time, when she would come to the house, I'd say to them, "Oh, Kay's going to do the community." They know what you're talking about. Kay would come and start the service. She would participate and say, "Everything is good, absolutely important." And then after the finish, she said, "What happened?"
It was the value of the present moment.
She knew all that was going on.
Can you just summarise that comment for the Zoomers' benefit?
Oh, sorry, the Zoomers. Hello, Zoomers. The lady was just sharing, was it your mother-in-law who had dementia, and it was Kay, now Archbishop Kay? Yeah, okay. When Kay would take communion to this lady's mother-in-law who had dementia, and the mother-in-law didn't really know much what was going on, but when the actual little service started, the lady's mother-in-law could recite all the words of the liturgy, just knew them. And I think that's one of the benefits of our Anglican liturgy, that the words become part of who we are. They never leave us. And, you know, maybe others have experienced this as well. You know, you just see it over and over again with older people, and particularly with people with dementia. The words just come, the hymns come, the responses come. But the lady was saying, though, that once the now Archbishop Kay finished, the mother-in-law didn't know what had happened. But it's re-emphasising the value of the present moment, and also the ongoing effect even for the rest of that day on the lady who received that day. It does make a difference. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, back there, please.
As a carer in aged care, we were told also never to accept any gifts given to us unless it was just a box of chocolates, because the following day the person's likely to not remember they gave you that, and they're quite likely later on down the track to report it as going missing, and happen to be missing after your visit.
Yes, that's probably a good rule of thumb. Yeah, and what really does annoy me a little bit is I sometimes see people just helping themselves to the residents' lollies and all of that. I think that's disrespectful. But yes, thank you. Best not to receive gifts. On that. Thank you. Yes.
We've got some aged people in our parish that all have different hearing aids. They seem to have different abilities to do different things in the parish, in the church during the service. And so we do have a lot of issues with that we try to gently deal with. So I just thought maybe it's also important to remember to be gentle with people when they're frustrated with their hearing.
Yes, thank you. That's just a reminder. thank you. It's another good point about older people still coming to church and the different types of hearing aids and having to adjust everything, and how we have to be patient with them as, you know, each time they come until they adjust their hearing aids until they can hear as best they can. Thank you for pointing that out. There and then over there. Thank you.
My name is Joyce. I've been working in aged care. I'm an RN, a nurse working in aged care for quite some time, and I felt like as a church we need to do a lot for the aged care. It's not that we are only wanting the services, but it's because there's no services that is coming regularly to visit them. So I think as a church we need to do a lot to help the aged care.
I think that, so thank you, Joyce, for commenting we need to do more. And on that, I remember when I've done some aged care and just being put in pokey little rooms, and I've gone to see the manager and saying, we're not here for our sake. We are here for the resident. This is for the residents. I mean, obviously we love to go, but this is for the residents, their spiritual care, and that needs to be honoured and respected. So I think it ties in with what you're saying. Thank you.
I'm Sharon. The last one, I think.
And I do pastoral care as a volunteer at Kalkani, that you're speaking of. So I keep in regular contact with the chaplain from there, and one of the ladies that he was concerned for wouldn't accept him, you know, to have a chat with or anything. And when I tried to, she wouldn't accept me. But what I found, she doesn't want anybody in her space. But if I stand at the doorway, she's quite happy to talk to me.
Thank you. So Sharon, was it Sharon? Yes, lovely to meet someone from Kalkani. They'd be some of the happiest moments of my time in the Avon Valley down at Kalkani. But Sharon was just saying one of the residents just didn't want people to talk to her. You've got a hand up at the back.
So I can let you finish before I ask anything.
Oh, okay. So Sharon would stand at the door and talk to the resident, and the resident would respond that way. But the resident had an issue with someone being in her personal space, and I'm sure probably historically good reasons for that. But well done for thinking through that, thinking outside the square, which is what we often have to do with older people and how we minister to them. Think outside the square a little bit. Yes.
Sorry, Julie. It was just out of what you said. If people feel that the messenger in a printed form should return, the 19th of August is your time to submit your motion to Synod, who would be very happy to hear your opinion. I'm sure you would agree.
I'm not eligible for Synod, so so yeah, I know. One last thing, I didn't do handouts because I didn't know whether anyone or how many would be interested in what I had to say. But if anyone would like a copy of my presentation, I've got a notepad there. Just write your email down, or my email is juliebleonard@gmail.com. You can just check that with me later, all lowercase, juliebleonard, Leonard, @gmail.com, and I'm happy to send you a copy which will have on it not for publication or distribution. That's purely for you today. Thank you.